He thought he ruled the school. He did not know who she was. The bus let out a scattered hum of students into Clearview High, and the hallway smelled like last night's rain and the faint metallic tang of locker deodorant. Maya Williams kept her head down, letting the current of bodies nudge her forward, backpack snug across her shoulders like armor. New girl meant quiet. New girl meant survival. Or at least that was the rule she followed after 3 different addresses and 4 different sets of school rules. Invisible was safer. Invisible kept conversations short, kept curiosity at bay. Clearview was a suburban high school with a stadium and soda shop pride that hung over everything. Posters for homecoming and the spring musical were tacked like pretty lies to bulletin boards. People here wore their statuses like shirts, neat, tailored, alphabetized. Maya could read the room faster than she let on. The quarterback's grin meant space cleared. The cheerleading braids meant an automatic halo. The kids with earbuds were dead zones. She navigated it like a map she'd been given last minute and never studied. Her first day, she had one rule: make no waves. Her second rule: know the predators. Predators in high school were not always wolves with fangs. They were practiced smiles, someone else's laughter that ended when you tried to join it. Mostly they were invisible powers that built little kingdoms out of other people's discomfort. Bryce Carter had built his kingdom on arrogance and timing. He was the kind of boy who announced his presence with a laugh that wanted to be a headline and a football jersey that declared ownership of Friday nights. He walked with shoulders rolled forward as if carrying a weight only he deserved. In the hallways, his friends parted like reeds before a storm. He had a laugh that cut and a generosity for humiliation that made it seem like entertainment rather than cruelty. Maya felt his constellation before she saw him, the ripple of attention as his sneaker scuffed the linoleum, the quick, sharp conversations shutting down mid-sentence. She kept walking, eyes down, strategy inward. Then a backpack banged against the lockers ahead, and a scattering of notebooks skittered like pigeons. Her hands knew the precise, minute twitch. 1 step left, 2-handed scoop. The hallway blurred into slow motion, a red folder flapping like a flag, a math textbook spinning, Bryce's laugh carving the air. "Watch it, new girl," he said, loud enough to tumble anyone who didn't know how to bear noise into awkwardness. The dozen heads that had been glued to their phones now tilted like sunflowers. His friends snorted. Someone took out a phone, the little rectangle a jury stall for the public. Maya crouched, collected her things, glued her face into a neutral expression. It was the exact blade she always used: calmness. She said nothing. The silence was a thing that belonged to her as much as the backpack on her shoulder.
When she rose, she met Bryce's eyes straight on, not with a challenge, simply an observation, the kind you offer someone you don't owe anything to. "You new here?" he asked, as if that explained the rules. His voice was syrup. He smelled faintly of cologne and something that screamed practiced charm. "Just moved," Maya said. Her voice was the soft kind that could be mistaken for shyness, and mistaken again for confidence. She kept one hand on her books and the other adjusted the strap so she'd look like she belonged somewhere. Bryce leaned in, theatrically close. Well, Clearview's got ways of making new people feel at home. He smiled in a way that was supposed to be friendly and ended up being a threat. No one stepped forward. That was their code. Silence was consent. Maya felt the muscle memory of prior moves, small arenas where she had learned to tuck herself away and wait. But there was something else at work now, an internal ledger she kept tallying, each insult, each shrug, every moment she'd stayed out of sight because attention bite not her fear, but her sense of justice. She did not flinch. Instead, she slid a small smile that didn't give him heat. Bryce's laugh was louder then, meant to puncture the little calm she'd built. Someone posted a slow, public grin like a cherry on top of the moment as cameras drew nearer. For a breath, the hallway belonged to him. Maya closed that book and walked on. That first confrontation was not monumental. It left no permanent scar, but it scratched a line under reality. He tried to make her the show because that was his entertainment. She refused. Stick around. The twist comes at the end. By the second week, Bryce had cataloged Maya like a new model car. Interesting for a while, then stale. He decided to try his experiment anyway. Experiments were the currency he traded in. He cornered her near the lockers with a grin he pitched like a hook. Someone had smeared something on the locker's metal, a prank aimed to humiliate. There was laughter, and someone took the angle of the moment and sent it instantly into the school's social channels. Tags sprouted like weeds. "New girl can't handle Clearview," read the caption in a voice that tried to be funny and landed in cruelty. Maya's locker door had been slapped with a smear of toothpaste and a sticky note reading, "Welcome." The act was petty, adolescent, designed to require a reaction. She breathed through the embarrassment like oxygen. She didn't need an audience to see her composure. The problem with bullies, she had learned, was that they were allergic to being ignored. So she did the most disarming thing she could. She cleaned it, wiped the smear with paper towels, and folded the sticky note into a neat square. Her hands were still, her face blank. An observer might have thought her indifferent. She wasn't. Observation was her strategy. She began to keep an informal ledger in her head, not of the injuries, but of the habits. Bryce's hours, the jokes he recycled, the cadence of his power plays. She cataloged allies and nervous bystanders. She noted the friend who laughed too loudly and the friend who always waited for the roar to die down before offering comfort. Those were the cracks. In the cafeteria, Bryce loved to stage. He staged humiliation like a director crafts a scene. Timing meant everything. That Tuesday, his targets were not always new girls. He'd cornered anyone who seemed vulnerable just for sport. Food trays clattered. The smell of fries was a thin veil over the underlying tension. Bryce's table was a small island with a flagpole of bravado, where everyone leaned into a fence like a communal ritual. He decided to roast Maya. You can't really roast someone who will not respond. Roasts require flame. He started small. Comments about her clothes, the way she folded napkins, the book she read. He threw in a rumor he had heard, polished and reshaped to sting. His cronies laughed as if they had invented delight. The sound was a hammer. People nearby snapped pictures, elevating the moment to content. Maya sat 3 tables away, a fortress of quiet. When the wave of laughter washed toward her, she did something unexpected. She smiled. A small, closed-lipped smile that made him look like a man who shouted into a void. That smile unsettled him. It was not submission, and it was not fear. It was a reminder that this wasn't the show he could command. He had to keep moving. So he escalated the jokes. He caught at anyone who would help him make her visible. He traded in embarrassments like baseball cards, collecting and trading impressions until his pile felt insurmountable. There were small victories he took at first, a tripped hallway, a whisper on a bus, but Maya learned the language of escalation fast. It was performative, and performance needed witnesses. She started watching those witnesses with more curiosity than fear. The ones who laughed first and smiled last, the ones whose phones stayed in their pockets when things got personal. Little patterns formed like constellations. There was a boy named Ryan who sat in the back of the cafeteria, shoulder always hunched as if to ground himself. He laughed at Bryce's jokes, but his eyes were different. Those eyes watched longer. Maya's patience wasn't a passive thing. It felt like work. On the surface, she kept to her role, reserved, polite, nothing to complain about. At night, she made lists of what she saw, things to remember, things not to react to. She kept to a schedule. She ran, did her homework, wrote short notes in a battered notebook she kept under her pillow. The notebook wasn't a diary exactly. It was an architecture of small plans, observations, and things she wanted to test. It maintained her dignity like a ledger. At home, she had a different kind of silence. Her mother was gone, an absence left like a missing chapter, and what remained was a quiet household with a man named Leo. He had been her guardian during moves, someone who cooked dinners and asked questions in a way that made her think aloud. He offered stability in the way that a steady clock does. He was not Bryce's type of man. He had no interest in applause or dominance. But he cared. He listened. "You don't have to be a martyr," Leo said one evening when Maya was washing dishes, a ritual that turned her mind quiet and clean. "You can tell me if it's bad. We can do something." Maya dried her hands slowly. She looked out the window where the suburb's streetlights threw long, polite shadows, and she considered the ledger. Telling felt like a shortcut that might hand Bryce more content. Doing nothing felt like a surrender of self. Instead, she chose a third way, deliberate response. "It's not about being a martyr," she told him. "It's about choosing how to react. There's a pattern. If I react every time, there is no end to it. If I wait, he will build up to something bigger and make the mistake." Leo's brow furrowed. He scraped the plate with a metal fork and set it on the counter. "Who makes the mistake?" he asked. "People who confuse volume for strength. Bullies are loud until they're seen as small. They build their power on other people's silence." Leo nodded, but concern made a caveat in his face. He was practical. "Promise me you won't take it alone if it gets worse." "I won't," she promised. It was not an absolute truth. It was a principle of principle. She would not use force. She would not humiliate. She would be deliberate. There was another reason Maya kept quiet. It wasn't only survival or strategy. It was secrecy. If you asked her, she would say nerves or luck. If someone at school pressed, she would say the obligatory thing, "My dad's in the military." That was the line she had rehearsed for move after move. But there was a fact she carried carefully like a smooth stone in her pocket. Her father was famous in a way that made people light up and then behave differently. Public faces create private fissures. He had chosen, for reasons that belonged to an earlier story, to remain out of the spotlight in her life. The name that sat in her memory felt heavy and entirely irrelevant to these corridors of adolescent power. She wanted to learn to stand on her own without the magnetism of recognition. So she let Bryce play his games, and she kept her ledger. She observed which of his jokes landed and which fizzled, which of his friends flinched at small acts of escalation, and which chuckled extra loud to cover discomfort. It was tedious and meticulous work, like watching waves erode a cliff one grain of sand at a time. A week before the midterm break, things picked up. Someone shoved a crumpled note into her locker, just words, crude in their simplicity. The content was a smear. Hardly the worst thing in the world, but something about its existence told her that the game had elevated from casual amusement to targeted attention. She considered turning it in. She considered showing Leo. But this time she folded the note and sealed it in the back of her notebook. Data. It felt like the right choice. She couldn't predict where the story would go, but she could see the scaffolding. At school, Bryce's confidence started to wobble in small ways. It was never dramatic, he didn't fall off his throne, but it showed in the way his laugh got a notch higher, the way his eyes darted at odd times as if peering into invisible mirrors. People who once laughed the loudest at his jokes slowed their cadence. That might have been coincidence, or the shifting politics of a school that traded in trends as currency. Maya cataloged each hesitation like a geologist notes tremors before an earthquake. One afternoon, on the way to chemistry, Maya passed Bryce in the hallway. He was surrounded by his usual orbit, the boys' chatter like an engine running hot. One of them, Ryan, dropped a line that had the old smugness, a crack in the armor meant to make someone small. "She acts like she doesn't see us," Ryan said theatrically, the kind of line you practice for effect. "Probably because she doesn't want to cash out her dignity." A hush answered his prose, then chuckles. Maya slowed. Her profile was composed. For a fraction of a second, Bryce looked at her with an expression she could not yet name. Curiosity? Doubt? A flicker. A crack. That was all it took. "You're not funny," she said quietly, the tone of someone resetting a conversation and expecting the other party to listen. "You should try being kind. It might feel different." There was a silence that wasn't showy. The space around them didn't fill with cameras. It felt like a legal document stapled closed. Bryce's mouth showed irritation. "Watch what you say, new girl." "I'm watching you," Maya said, and she passed. He watched her go. That was the first time he lingered with a look that contained something like calculating numbers in his head. If Bryce was a storm, then the Charger was a sun. The first time the two collided, it felt like the beginning of a new weather system, something that didn't belong on a normal school day. It was after practice, and the stadium lights blurred the dusk into an industrial blue. Students drifted toward the parking lot, voices rising with the warmth of a late summer. Maya had stayed behind to talk to a teacher about an assignment, then meandered toward her car. She had tried, for the past week, to show availability to the school in measured doses, a strategic presence so she could see what else moved in the margins. A deep basso hum moved along the asphalt before a shape emerged. It wasn't the sort of car that came often to suburban parking lots. It hovered in the peripheral vision of the usual pickups and sedans like a cinematic insert. A Charger, wide and low, black as a secret. Its chrome winked like an announcement. Students slowed, voices tilting into the shape of attention. Someone whistled. Someone shouted a name into the air on instinct. "Whoa!" Maya felt the air change. The kind of silence that had followed Bryce's laugh had a cousin now, a charged stillness. The Charger idled in front of Maya like an actor waiting for a cue. Its engine breathed with a low, contented rumble that seemed to steal the last residue of juvenile bravado from the lot. People turned to look. Phones rose as if attending mass. Bryce's circle broke as if at the sound of a bell. For the first time, he was stripped of the full stage. The Charger's presence was a new authority. It did not shout. It simply occupied space the way mountains do in landscapes, force without motion. She recognized the man who stepped out because the man had lived in her childhood like an off-stage rhythm. He was not a living headline for her. He was just a figure who moved with a calm that made people lower their voices. He had the familiar quiet of someone accustomed to attention and not needing it. He was taller than he appeared on screens, a wide-shouldered man with a silent, disarming smile and a voice that, when he spoke, pulled the buzz of a crowd into a soft attention. The Charger's arrival did what charm rarely did. It stopped games. Bryce's eyes darkened with a new calculation. For the first time since he had been High King in that hallway, he seemed like a boy walking into a room where the adult presence didn't check in with his authority. "Miss Williams?" the man asked, and his voice had the small, private softness people used at home. "Ready?" Maya closed her locker and didn't look embarrassed by the exchange, because her relationship with this man was not about spectacle. It had its own rules, complicated and private. She slid into the front passenger seat, and the silence between them held 1,000 sentences she never had to say. He shut the door, the metal sound solid and precise, and the engine hummed with a contentment that swallowed the last echo of Bryce's chatter. Bryce stood frozen, a statue made out of performative aggression. His friends scrambled to pretend he hadn't been undone by a car and a man. They laughed nervously. Someone muttered, "Who is that?" Maya watched his mouth move and noticed how small it looked. She had seen him at his peak and at his push. This was a new thing, an arrival that didn't bend to his mood. For a moment, the school was rewritten in terms that did not include his approval. That moment should have ended in a triumph for power and nothing more, but it sparked a new conflict rather than a conclusion. Bryce retreated to his friends with tighter smiles, hands clenched into pockets. He tried to shipper the moment aside, but the image of a passenger stepping into a dark Charger and being escorted away had lodged in the school's feed like a challenge. They drove home along a ribbon of early evening traffic. The Charger sliced through the noise as if it had a destination outside the map. Maya was quiet. She could feel students' eyes on the car like a current tugging at a submerged line. She didn't need rescue. That word had never fit her. The man in the driver's seat was not a rescuer. He was an ally. That distinction mattered. "You made it through the first week," he said without turning. His voice had a soft, unobtrusive authority. Maya tucked her hair behind her ear. "Barely." He looked at her from the corner of his eye, and something like a parent's satisfaction spread across his face. "You don't have to fight alone." "I never asked to," Maya said. Her voice was measured, the sort that puts stakes on words without raising the volume. "I didn't ask for you to show up like that." He made a small, almost amused sound. "I didn't either," he said. "But when you told me they were making things difficult, I wanted to make sure you were safe leaving practice." Maya watched the city pass by, a line of side streets with mailboxes, a diner with one neon letter burned out. Her life existed between these small scenes, school corridors and the interior of a car where conversations were economical and important. "How long can you stay hidden?" she asked casually, the question she had skirted all her life. It was a query about privacy and about identity and about what happens to a little gravity when you add a famous name to the formula. He smiled like someone amused by the architecture of privacy. "As long as you want it." There was a pause. "But you don't have to hide everything because of a few loud people." Maya breathed. People react differently when a name appears next to a face. He nodded, but his expression made no moves toward the public. "Names don't change the work. You do." That statement could have been the end of a conversation, but there was more. They talked, not in detail, there was a whole life of specifics that would boringly complicate things, but in small, strategic terms. He asked the right minimal questions. Is it getting worse? Who's involved? Does anyone post worse stuff privately? She answered with the ledger she kept in her head. "It's escalating," she admitted. "It's mostly performative, but it might go further if left." He listened the way he listened to everything, with an ease that allowed people to believe he had known them longer than he really did. "We keep everything legal and above board," he said. "It was already assumed. They didn't need to waste energy on edges. And you're sure you don't want this to be about me stepping in?" "I'm sure," she said. It's mine. I want to learn how to handle it. If it's some broken chess move, I want to make sure I plan it." "Patience," he said, almost smiling at her. "That was my dad's favorite word. He would say, 'Watch the other man's hand more than the cards.'" She filed that away. "Patience," she repeated, testing it like a new piece of jewelry. That night, at her kitchen table, plates of pasta between them, they fleshed out the edges without directing the war. He asked about witnesses, the names of those who'd posted pictures, who'd laughed loudest, and who'd kept their phones silent. He asked pragmatic questions, timestamps, locations, who might remember more. He never once suggested something that veered into spectacle. His presence, instead of becoming a showpiece, felt like reinforcement, someone who would make sure the scales stayed even. "You're not here to be the headline," Maya said finally, stirring her pasta. "You're here so the headline doesn't decide what the story is." He let out a breath that was part laugh, part relief. "That's a very good line," he said. "You keep saying things that sum up the whole problem." They planned like two people mapping a small forest. She would continue her ledger. He would quietly ask a few questions of friends he trusted. He would keep his own presence to permitted actions, calls to school administrators if things crossed thresholds, speaking to the coach about sideline behavior if necessary, watching from a distance like a lighthouse. He made it clear he wouldn't turn this into a spectacle. That promise mattered to Maya because it let her remain the center of any eventual solution. In the days that followed, social currents shifted subtly. Bryce tested his options: louder jokes, faux generous gestures, an attempt to co-opt pity. But each time he tried to reclaim the center, the crowd recalibrated ever so slightly. Friends of convenience started to glance away when he delivered his punchlines. Ryan's laugh wasn't as assured. Someone who'd been first to like Bryce's posts went quiet in a corner chat. The school was an organism. A tiny infection of doubt had been introduced. Maya watched these things, not with triumph, but with the dry measurement of someone looking at changing numbers. Each small reaction was data. She didn't celebrate. She didn't publish a manifesto. She continued to move through her life. Chemistry homework, cross-country practice, laughter with a classmate who liked old movies. Her life remained cumulative in small joys. But Bryce noticed. He was not a man trained in humility. The changes irritated him like a splinter. He tried amplifying his antics, trading in risk for a bigger payoff. He orchestrated a prank that flopped, coordinated to make Maya the centerpiece of a cruel joke that would be filmed and forwarded. He handed a microphone to a junior and told him to ask Maya a question in front of a crowd, something embarrassing he hoped would go viral within their small ecosystem. The junior hesitated. He did not want the backlash. That hesitancy made Bryce aggressive.
He pushed harder. "Do it now," he barked. The junior caught someone's glance across the hallway, a subtle, forbidding look from a coach, perhaps, or the weight of a guardian's presence at the edge of the crowd. He swallowed and said nothing. There was a crack, then, in the armor of pageantry. It was not dramatic. It was 100 small refusals, like oxygen leaking from a balloon. People who used to film now put their phones away, deciding the joke was too mean for an audience. The world was making a choice. Bryce noticed. His hands tightened, and for the first time his laugh had an edge like someone talking through a closed mouth. But a bully's instinct is to go bigger, to try and regain lost territory with one grand gesture. In the meantime, Maya continued her patient watch, compiling mental notes and small physical evidence she kept in a folder on her laptop, screenshots, times, comments that landed like evidence. She never posted. This was not about public shaming. This was about clarity. She wanted the truth to come out on its own terms. One afternoon, as leaves fell in thin confetti down the sidewalks, someone tapped her locker and tossed in a folded piece of paper. It was a note with words that tried to be powerful and ended up feeling like a child's tantrum. She smiled inwardly at their attempt to intimidate. She climbed the stairs with the paper in her palm like a small stone in a pocket. She cataloged it like everything else, data, folded it into a sleeve, and kept walking. There was a rhythm to how she lived now. Listen, watch, bide. Her notebook swelled with the small entries of a patient mind. She began conversations with Ryan at neutral moments, watched him fidget and say things that were not entirely aligned with Bryce's cruelty. He fumbled compliments about Mexican food, about a film he liked, about the idea of someone being quiet but observant. He was the kind of friend who might have laughed if the current had been different. Maya sensed he would not be the first to stand up, but he might be the first to not help. One evening, a week after the Chargers' arrival, they stood on the back porch and watched the sunset bruise into purple. Maya felt the fatigue of vigilance. The ledger had grown heavy. "You sure you want to keep this all inside the school?" he asked, because practicality demanded the question. "Some of this can be handled by talking to people who can do something about it." "I know what you're suggesting," she said. "If I go public, it becomes about the car and not the behavior. I want the behavior to be what's seen." He was silent a long time, looking at the horizon as if reading an old map. "Then we do it your way," he said finally. "But promise me you won't be alone when it gets worse." Maya looked at him, and for the first time the secret she kept, the fact of their relationship, the public persona he carried, felt less like a liability and more like a resource. It was not a weapon. It was a support beam. She agreed, not because she needed an audience, but because the ledger had a page where danger might be listed.
and it was smarter to have an ally when the page turned. The tension in school thickened like humidity before a storm. Bryce felt cornered. He began to talk privately, to trade whispers that made him feel impressive in the short term. He thought of one big move that would reassert his authority once and for all. If you take the long view of the ledger, you can see the logic. Get one big win and erase the sliding doubt. Adolescence is a theater of gestures. He planned a spectacle that would place him at center stage again. Maya knew a spectacle when she saw the signs. Rumors might be sown, a prank might be amplified, a staged apology might be designed to look like contrition. She didn't panic, she cataloged. She made a list of what could be used as evidence and what would not hold up. She began to lean on a quiet army, the few kids who had watched long enough to notice the way Bryce's jokes became personal. She spoke to a teacher she trusted in a way that didn't create headlines, but planted a seed. She asked questions of the junior who had been given the microphone at the cafeteria, not in an accusatory tone, but in a way that invited truth. The stage was set in slow increments. Maya's patient strategy looked at the timeline like a chessboard. Let the bully play himself into narrow moves. Let his friends step back on their own when the social costs shifted. Let a mistake be big enough to be undeniable and small enough that it wouldn't tear lives apart. She wasn't interested in revenge. She wanted clarity. She wanted a world where small cruelty did not confine someone to silence. The charger had shown up once. The world had rearranged for a moment. The real story, Maya knew, would not rely on one engine's growl. It would be the sound of people finally deciding not to keep that engine running. The ledger was not about one car or one famous person. It was about refashioning a culture where loud didn't equal right. She prepared the evidence she had, not to hurt, but to illuminate. She made copies of messages that hinted at the pattern, not humiliating details, but clear threads that tied jokes back to cruelty. She saved screenshots with timestamps, and she did the hard thing of making them coherent without turning them into spectacle. It was legal and careful, a clinician's approach to an emotional injury. Bryce's anger, meanwhile, became a room that kept heating up with no windows. He tried to reclaim attention with acts of bravado, pranks that fell flat, staged gestures of apology that smelled of artifice. People noticed the smells. They retreated. Social media habits twisted, and the likes slowed. Ryan's eye contact, once peripheral, became central in small moments like hallway intersections. The shift was slow and uncomfortable, like a tide that took patience to register. Then came the day of the near mistake, a planned prank intended to ruin Maya in front of the class. Bryce had recruited a latecomer to play a part. The plan was clumsy, and worse, it relied on the cooperation of people who were suddenly less inclined to be a part of it. The junior chickened out at the last second, and the prank became, instead, a parody of itself that landed on Bryce's own face as people realized how mean the premise was. The laughter that had been meant for Maya turned into an awkward, nervous chorus that sought an exit. Bryce's face reddened, then springed into a new kind of rage. He grabbed at control with words. Maya stood tall, watched him for a beat, and said nothing. His fury looked inflamed now, less like command and more like a man trying to hold on to a story that no longer fit. His friends shuffled closer to him like a flock of birds, unsure which tree to land on. Some laughed, others stared down at their shoes. The momentum had shifted. People wanted distance from cruelty packaged as humor. It was not dramatic, it was an accumulation of small choices. And Maya, who had hidden so carefully for so long, felt the ledger finally start to tilt. That night, as she packed her bag, the world felt heavy with possible endings. She had performed patience like an art form, cataloging and waiting. The charger remained a sound in the rearview mirror of her life, a reassuring note, but not the drumbeat. There was still a long road ahead. She had not exposed, not yet. The big mistake her opponents worried she would make had not happened. Instead, things had crooked toward a place where the truth might reveal itself without the theatrics she feared. And yet she knew the plan was a fragile thing. It depended on people choosing a different rhythm. It depended on friends like Ryan deciding not to be complicit. It depended on the school picking a different value than laugh first, think later. The ledger was thorough but not omniscient. There were moves she could not control. When she lay down that night, she felt an odd mix of fatigue and readiness. The world had shifted in small ways. Bryce was no longer the undisputed king of a kingdom built on fear. He was wobbling, unmoored by truths that did not care about his timing. But the final move had not been made. The school buzzed like a wire waiting for a pluck. Maya slept with the feeling of a plan humming like a low note. The next morning she would go back to Clearview High, and the school would breathe like a patient on the verge of awakening. She had set the pieces, she had patience, she had a quiet ally who kept to legal bounds, and a ledger of evidence waiting for the right moment. Above all, she had learned the thing she had wanted most, the ability to stand in a hall and not be defined by what other people shouted at her. She had learned to wield silence like armor and strategy like a silent arrow. What she did next would not be spectacle.
It would be the slow, inevitable work of truth finding its way into light. The charge's engine rustled in her memory like a promise, but it was not the promise she relied on. It was merely the sound that told her someone else understood restraint. Her victory would be quieter than that. It would be the unmooring of a cruelty that had, until now, been accepted as entertainment. When she walked back into school that morning, the hallways looked different to her. The posters still plastered the same slogans, the students still arranged themselves into familiar tribes, but there was a small stiffness around Bryce, a thinning of the crowd that had been there before. Eyes that used to follow him now found other places to rest. It was the smallest of victories, and it felt like wind under a wing. She slid into a desk and opened her notebook, the place where she kept her ledger. There were coffee rings and small notations, the careful bookkeeping of someone who had decided to fight without raising a hand. The school bell rang like a starting gun. The game began again, but this time she knew where the exits were. Outside, someone revved a car. The charger hummed like a memory. Maya looked up, met the window's reflection of her own face, and breathed. She had no intention of letting anyone, especially Bryce Carter, know what she had in play. The ledger was hers. The story's next beats would have to be played with care. She closed the notebook and walked to class, toward a future she intended to claim on her own terms. The bell that morning had a different taste to it, not sweeter exactly, but clearer. Maya moved through the corridors with the same quiet gait, but she felt less like a ghost and more like someone who had finally found the right suit for the part she intended to play. The ledger was closed that week and filed. The evidence was organized and quiet, like books on a shelf waiting for a reader. She hadn't announced anything. That's how it had to be. She met with Mrs. Alvarez between classes, a history teacher with a habit of saying things plainly and a nameplate that had seen 2 principals. The conversation wasn't dramatic. Maya placed her laptop on the desk and slid it open, the screen a neat, clinical list. Time-stamped screenshots, group chat threads where Bryce's jokes had gone from mean to personal, a handful of public comments that turned private cruelties into a pattern. Everything was labeled, everything verifiable. She'd made copies and kept originals. She'd done the work. Mrs. Alvarez listened like she was cataloguing a case study. "You've done this carefully," she said. "I didn't want a mess. I wanted clarity." Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "We can do this the right way. We'll take it up to administration. If the evidence shows a pattern, there will be consequences, but we handle it through the school. Rules, protocols, the counselor. Public shaming doesn't help anyone long-term." That answer pleased and relieved Maya. The ledger had been for more than revenge. It was for accountability. Let the school do what schools do. Investigate, call families, move through the paperwork of discipline. Let the truth stand up under procedure. Still, truth sometimes needed to be visible for the community to change. Mrs. Alvarez surprised Maya with a pragmatic solution, a school-wide anti-bullying display planned around Lunch and Learn, a series Mrs. Alvarez organized with the student council and the counselor. It would be framed as a learning moment. Evidence would be presented, policies reviewed, and the community would be asked to reckon with what had been normalized. "We have to make the invisible behavior visible," Mrs. Alvarez said, "not to humiliate, but to educate." Maya agreed, but with conditions. The display would include only messages and posts that were already public or submitted with consent. It would be moderated, factual, and connected to resources for rebuilding trust. Nothing private, nothing cruel in the name of revenge. Mrs. Alvarez arranged meetings. The counselor, Mr. Hines, nodded his approval and promised to bring support. The principal asked for a copy of Maya's file for review. Word moved through Clearview the way wind moves through leaves, gently at first, then with a rustle that becomes hard to ignore. Bryce's circle tried to do damage control, staged smiles, defensive posts, a badly worded apology letter written more to conserve status than express regret. The posts felt practiced. They invited the kind of doubt that made people look at a performer trying too hard. The day of the Lunch and Learn arrived gray and thin, cafeteria lights buzzing overhead. Students drifted in, curiosity like a magnet. Posters around the commons read, "Speak Up," and "What Kindness Looks Like." Mrs. Alvarez stood at the front, clipboard in hand. Mr. Hines had a stack of pamphlets about conflict resolution on the table. Maya sat near the back in case she wanted to leave. She didn't. They showed a timeline. They explained how patterns formed when small jokes escalated, and why people who laughed once might feel compelled to keep laughing. They read anonymous testimony about feeling humiliated and unsafe. Then, without cinematic flair and without a single sensationalist flourish, they laid out the facts Maya had gathered, where comments had been made, how jokes had migrated into cruelty, screenshots of public posts and group chats where Bryce's language had been sharp and dismissive. Each item had context, date, place, who was present. They called it evidence of harm rather than proof to destroy. The room held its breath in a new way. People who had clicked like on a joke post felt the weight of those actions in a light they hadn't carried before. Ryan sat near the center, jaw working like he was chewing on something he regretted.
Bryce sat at a table trying to look unaffected. The practiced swagger was thinner with every slide. At the end of the assembly, Mr. Hines read a statement from the principal. Investigations would continue. Disciplinary steps were possible. Counseling would be offered to those affected, and a meeting with athletic leadership would be scheduled. There would be no instant carnival of judgment. There would be procedures, consequences, and an opportunity for repair. The nearest thing to an eruption came afterward, not from the stage, but at the cluster of lockers where Bryce often stood as if it were his throne. Someone had placed a small neutral bulletin board on his locker that afternoon, a student council initiative turned symbolic. It bore the title Choices and Consequences, and instead of the kinds of cruel memes kids sometimes stick to lockers, it listed behaviors and their effects. Because the board sat in the place where his power had usually been performed, it felt like a gentle reclaiming of space more than a punishment. Into that light, people pinned their reactions, short notes about what it felt like to be made into content, suggestions for bystander behavior, offers of apology when students realized they had laughed without thinking. A few printed screenshots that had been shown during the assembly, public comments, captioned posts, group messages shared with consent from those who had received them, were put on the board as examples of why the conversation mattered. The board was curated calmly, with adult oversight. The intent wasn't to shame, but to illuminate what patterns looked like, right there in the public hallway. Bryce found it. He pushed through a group of students and stood in front of the board like a man who had been asked to explain a crime he had not expected to see written down. His face was a map of muscles resisting the vulnerable. He reached for one of the pinned printouts and flipped it with a theatrical scoff. "Who put this up?" he demanded. "It was planned," Mrs. Alvarez said from nearby, composed. "Part of the lunch and learn." "It's a joke," Bryce said, but his voice had a cracking edge. "This is just—" "You made jokes at other people's expense," Mr. Hines said, steady. "We showed the school the pattern. We're following up with families and with the athletic department. Some of what was pinned here is public or submitted with consent. We're not here to humiliate in private. We're here to name harm and ask the community to respond differently." A few of Bryce's friends shuffled. Someone's smirk dissolved into a look that asked for permission to feel bad. He grabbed at retorts. "You don't understand. It was just fun. They were overreacting." Maya watched him from the edge of the crowd. He finally saw her and took a step forward, rage trying to shape itself into words. "You did this."